Okay, so it looks like we've got a good amount of people that have tuned in, and so I think I'll just kind of get started. So kind of just a quick introduction of how we got to be at this webinar today, so kind of the roots of this program. Started with myself and some coworkers at the Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District up in Maine, and we applied for a grant from the Quimby Family Foundation, who are the people that do the Burt's Bees products. And so they like to support their Maine community here. And we applied for this grant to do some community agriculture in the town of Gorham, Maine. And so this is kind of our second year of the program. It's got a few different components to it. So one of them is, of course, the educational aspect. So we do both youth programs as well. We did summer camps last year, and we're kind of working on how we're going to continue that for this summer as well. And then the other part is doing adult education. So this was originally scheduled as an in-person workshop, but of course that couldn't quite be carried out given the situation. So here we are on a webinar, and I'm actually really excited and kind of humbled at the reach that we have for where people are coming from today. I think we were able to reach a lot more people than we would have with our in-person workshops, so that's pretty exciting to kind of get these efforts out there. The other parts of our program in Gorham included installing 2 food forests. So if you aren't familiar with the concept of a food forest, it's kind of a landscaped area where you're picking plants that are going to work well together to kind of mimic the natural forest ecology. So we installed 2 of those in the town of Gorham, and we're hoping to have some volunteer opportunities coming up this year. So if you're local and interested in getting more involved in that, please let us know. And then the third part of this program was an edible Main Street component. So we worked with some of the businesses in the town of Gorham to set up planter boxes that had all edible vegetables and herbs so that people could kind of walk around the town and harvest things that they might need to eat. So each box kind of had a theme. And so we ended up with 24 planters last year, and this year we're trying to double that program and have 48 planters. So for those of you that donated toward this program, all of that money is going towards the materials for a group of Girl Scouts in Gorham to be able to build those boxes. So we're essentially doubling our capacity for that program thanks to those Girl Scouts, which is really exciting. So if you have questions throughout Aaron's presentation, you can use the chat box and I'll kind of relay them to him. So there might be a little bit of a delay. And the last webinar we did, we actually found that some of the other participants were able to help answer those questions as well. And this video will be recorded. It will be posted after, and I'll send out a follow-up email to everybody to share that video if you need to refer back to it, and also some follow-up information like Aaron's handout or his contact information if you have any additional questions, or information about our program in Gorham if that's something you're interested in getting involved in or starting something similar in your area. Well, I had been trying to set up a poll to kind of get a better idea of where people were coming from, but this is a new feature in Microsoft Teams, so this is kind of our experiment, and it doesn't seem to have been going very well. So thank you everyone for signing on today, and thank you so much for all the donations towards this program. And I think, Damon, did I miss anything?
No, I think that was really good, Jenna. Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm on the Conservation District staff. I just wanted to say, you know, in the context of these times, it's really good for us all to be thinking about new ways to grow food. This crisis has threatened a lot of our systems and shown them to be less resilient than we would like. So, and that includes our food systems, unfortunately. So think about ways that you can add more food, local food to our economy, to our system. Share some of these lessons with others. Please, you know, take them with you today and you share the recording, share the information you learn. And thanks again for being here. And if you have any tech issues, as Jenna said in her other email, please let me know.
And I see a comment from Kristen about the donations, and when I send a follow-up email, I'll include the link to our website where we can continue to accept donations as well. So I think I'll turn it over to Aaron now, and he can work out his presentation. So Aaron's a local, he runs a local nursery in Falmouth, Maine, and is kind of an expert in edible plants.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Parker, and I'll just give a little bit of background about myself before I get into my edible landscaping presentation. I have been working with plants pretty much my whole life, and for the past 15 years or so, I have made the bulk of my money by doing landscaping. And when I started doing landscaping on my own, as opposed to working for someone else, I really wanted to focus on edible landscapes and kitchen gardens. And I found that a lot of the plants I wanted to use in those edible landscapes were not available, and either not available locally or just not available at all. So I started growing more and more nursery stock to support my edible landscaping business, and that's how I came to start Edgewood Nursery. And these days I've actually been doing a lot more on the nursery end than landscaping, which is just because I prefer that, and there's more, it's more of an open niche in our area. So this spring is actually my first year that I've been able to focus exclusively on nursery. So it's been a lot of fun, and normally this is where I would invite you to come visit and check it out, but not doing too much of that these days. But the nursery is open for business. I'm just asking people to either order through my website, edgewood-nursery.com, or you can give me a call or send me an email with an order, and I'll get your order together, and they'll let you know when you can come pick it up curbside. All right, so that's probably enough about me. I'm gonna hit the slideshow momentarily. All right, can everyone see that first slide?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I like to start off this presentation by encouraging everyone to look at the plants around them in their existing landscape, because there might be a lot more edible plants there than you might think. So it can be really useful to take some time, especially this time of year, to go around and try to identify any plants in your landscape that you don't know. It's also a good practice to look up the plants that you do know on a web database called Plants for a Future. And Plants for a Future is a huge database of thousands and thousands of species, and it gives you just sort of a baseline amount of information about that plant's edibility. So that can be really handy. And the first example I like to cite of edible plants that are probably already in your landscape is the dandelion. We're kind of in peak dandelion season right now. Lots of people are familiar with eating dandelion greens, but that's actually pretty much my least favorite part of the dandelion. My favorite part to eat is the flower. And if you've never eaten dandelion flowers, I highly recommend it. They're much less bitter than the leaves, and they have a really pleasant flavor. I like to eat them just out of hand, or sometimes I'll throw them in a salad. But there's many different ways you can prepare them. They are also really delicious dipped in batter and fried. like almost anything you might dip in batter and fry. Hosta is another edible plant that's pretty ubiquitous in American landscaping. And this is also prime time to try eating hosta. All varieties of hosta are edible, but if you ate them at the stage you see in this photograph, you might not be thrilled because once those leaves fully open, they get pretty fibrous pretty quickly. So you want to harvest hosta as a spring shoot, kind of like you might eat asparagus as a spring shoot, but you would never eat a mature asparagus when it's 6 feet tall and kind of has that ferny form. I think hosta is best cooked. It's totally edible raw, but sautéed with a little butter and garlic, they're quite delicious. This is another edible landscape tree that a lot of people don't realize is edible, the Kousa Dogwood. If you're not familiar with the fruit that looks like that. Oh, my screen share went away. Let's try and get back to that. There we go. If you're not familiar with the fruit, you might be more familiar with the flowers. It's a really beautiful landscape tree. And these fruit are very variable. I have eaten ones that taste just like a ripe mango, and they're a really lovely, super sweet, tasty tropical fruit, or tropical tasting fruit. And I've eaten other Kousa Dogwood fruit that just don't taste like anything. They're not sweet. They're just have no flavor at all. So that's one that is worth experimenting with, but without tasting the fruit first, it can be a little bit difficult to tell whether they'll be tasty or not. All species and all parts of clover are edible. I think the flowers are the best part, and kids often enjoy pulling out individual florets and sucking the nectar out of them, which is obviously quite sweet. But the leaves of the clover are also edible, and the whole thing is very high in protein. And this is a common like lawn and garden weed. They just pop up everywhere, and also really good bee forage. So not only are they fixing nitrogen out of the atmosphere to feed other plants, but they're also food for humans and food for bees. Common milkweed. This is a native plant that is starting to get a little bit more of appreciation because it's the host plant for the larval stage of monarch butterflies. And it's also a really nice perennial vegetable for humans. This one is a little bit more complicated to eat because there are specific times and specific parts of the plant that are edible to humans, and other parts are inedible. And any part should be thoroughly cooked before you eat it. But my favorite part are the spring shoots. They look like little asparagus shoots. Really tender, really flavorful, super tasty. You can also eat the flower buds and the immature seed pods. And that's one that I do recommend looking up a little more information before you try it. I recommend the website Eat the Weeds. And you also want to be sure that you're properly identifying the plant before you try eating it. All species of violet are edible, and there's many species of violets around. My personal favorite is Viola odorata, the sweet violet, which has a really amazing sort of floral fragrance and flavor. But really, any species makes a nice addition to a salad, or a nice decoration on a like a frosted cake or something like that. Some little edible flowers, or to decorate the top of the salad. Hey, Jenna, can you check and make sure that everyone else is muted? I'm getting some weird feedback-like sounds.
Yep, I got that too. So everyone, just make sure you're on mute. Otherwise, we kind of get some weird interruptions. Thanks.
So a lot of flowering. Oh, screen share went away again. A lot of flowering ornamental trees either have edible aspects or make good root stalks for grafting on edible varieties. So these flowering cherries, which are beautiful in their own right, but don't really produce any food, can be grafted onto. So you can have, you could remove one branch or more of flowering cherry and graft on an edible cherry or other stone fruit. And that's because Prunus species, so all the stone fruits like cherry, peach, plum, apricot, they all intergraft really well. So you can often take a branch off of a flowering cherry and graft on a branch of another type of stone fruit. And depending on the rootstock, you may run into incompatibility issues, but they usually work. And the same is true of crab apples. Most crab apples will accept a graft from pretty much any culinary apple variety. And you can use that to quickly convert existing ornamental trees to trees that are also beautiful, but then at the end of the season produce food as well. Acorns are a really underutilized food resource. There are oak trees all over the state of Maine and all over the world, really. All acorns do require some amount of processing to be turned into human edible food. And it can seem like a lot of work, but the product you get at the end, which is usually acorn flour, is really nutritious, really delicious. And compared to growing and processing grain, it's actually not that much work, because the whole process of growing it requires basically no input from you. All you have to do is pick up the acorns off the ground, and then there's some work involved in processing them into food. And if that's something that you are interested in learning more about, you can check out my social media on Instagram and on Facebook, and there's a lot of information from this fall and winter where I was processing acorns, and I'll have more classes and more information on that coming up in the fall when it's time to start processing acorns again. This is a plant that I would never recommend planting, but if you already have Japanese knotweed around, you might as well do something useful with it. And again, perfect time of year right now to try eating Japanese knotweed shoots. So basically, when the Japanese knotweed is coming up and it's around under a foot tall, it's still tender enough to eat. And most people recommend cooking it like you would rhubarb. So you can stew it down and make a sauce, or you can mix it with fruit and it adds a nice sour element to a fruit pie or fruit crumble or what have you. So the next part of this presentation has to do with different styles of landscaping, and really any style of landscape can be an edible landscape. It all just has to do with the type of plants in that you select, and those plants can be arranged in any sort of way to fit your practical and aesthetic needs. I like to think about landscape styles being on this sort of scale from naturalized to formal, and there's a million stops in between those two poles, and I tend to favor a more naturalized landscape, like the one in this picture. And the reason for that is I find that naturalized landscapes are more productive of food and medicine and habitat, and they require less labor because you're more or less letting the plants complete their life cycle and live their lives without too much interference. There's always some labor involved, and some plants getting, taking up more space than you want them to, and plants showing up that you don't want. So it's not that there are no maintenance landscapes, but they're definitely lower maintenance than a more formalized arrangement. Naturalized landscapes also don't require very much in the way of outside inputs. You might, add some wood chips or some tree leaves, but those are usually available locally and usually for free. Whereas a more formal landscape, you might require materials and inputs that aren't available locally or are more expensive and costly. So this is what you might call a forest garden type landscape. There are multiple fruit trees and larger canopy trees in this picture. There are perennial vegetables, culinary herbs, berries, medicinal herbs, and some annual vegetables in there too. Here's another view of that same garden. This is what some people call a guild or a polyculture. And in the center of the picture, you can see a fruit tree. That's an apple. And it's surrounded with many edible species, such as lovage over here, walking onions, chives. There's some violets down here, and as well as inedible support plants like this comfrey in the background and tansy over here. So the edible plants can support the environment and support the good health of the tree, and then some of the support plants help that tree grow using a minimum of outside input and minimizing the amount of labor and input needed from humans to produce a healthy crop. So this is looking from my driveway to my house, and along this sort of grassy path area, there are a lot of annual vegetables. So you can see corn and sweet potatoes and kale, as well as some perennial borders they're all part of that edible landscape. And here's another view of some tomatoes, which are, obviously an annual vegetable here in the north, and then a perennial border of comfrey and perennial vegetables like Turkish rocket and Good King Henry and marshmallow. Edible landscapes. A lot of what I just showed you are perennial plants, and I like perennials because they are very low maintenance, and I think they pair really well with some level of annual vegetable production because a lot of the perennial vegetables are early, so early in the season. So here at my house, we've been harvesting perennial vegetables for a few weeks now. Let's say maybe about 3 weeks. And most of our annual vegetables, at least the ones that aren't in the hoop house, are barely started yet. So we have peas that were planted weeks ago, and they're about 2 inches tall and weeks and weeks away from producing. But we have, perennial vegetables that are really at peak production right now. But annual vegetables can be very beautiful as well. This is an edible landscape featuring primarily annual vegetables. So there's this neat spiderweb shaped trellis covered in pole beans. And behind that, you can see a large bed of squash with bronze fennel and zinnias coming out of it. I think there's another view of that. Yep. Those actually might be dahlias. But so we've got fennel, squash, annual flowers, all in this edible landscape. Edible landscapes can be any size. This little tea garden is probably about, let's say, 2 feet by 3 feet. It features about, looks like 6 or 7 species of tea herbs and culinary herbs. So you can squeeze some edible plants into just about any space that's available. So now I've got some pictures coming up of more formal landscapes. These are from Wheelwright Landscapes. Pretty much all of these pictures have some level of edibility in them. This picture, I would say about a third of the plants are edible. And this is a formally laid out kitchen garden. So those are pretty much all annual vegetables. There's a few annual flowers in there too. This is a nice sort of halfway between the naturalized and the formal setting. There's a lot of nice stonework in there and annual flowers. It's very showy. But it also incorporates some annual and perennial vegetables like this garlic and potatoes in the foreground. So another view of the vegetable garden and another vegetable garden incorporating raised beds and a wattle fence. So once you've figured out what plants you might already have that are edible and what sort of style you would like to have in the landscaping that you'll be working with, you can start to think about implementing that. And now is a wonderful time to do that. We've had such a cool spring here in New England that even if you haven't done anything and you're just today starting to think about planting a garden, it's still not too late, but you should should, get on that as soon as possible. And the way that I like to create new garden spaces is through a technique called sheet mulching. Sheet mulching allows you to get rid of turf grasses, weeds, and other unwanted plant material and kind of make a blank slate to plant the plants that you want to grow. And it's much less labor intensive and much less hard on the soil biology than double digging or tilling or plowing. So that's great for you. And it also, by preserving those soil communities as much as possible, you give yourself a edge in on the growing season, and make you've created a lot less problems. Another nice thing about sheet mulching is once you sheet mulch an area, you tend to get about a 1-year grace period where there's really minimal weeding. So sheet mulching begins by cutting down the existing plant material as low as you can cut it. And you can then add any soil amendments or compost or organic material that you want to add to those garden beds. These pictures are from Mount Joy Orchard, which is at 181 Washington Ave in Portland. It's a free-to-pick public orchard, all maintained with volunteer labor. And in this picture, we've put down a bunch of fall tree leaves and compost. And you can see this sort of a pattern. And that is because we didn't want to waste our precious compost and soil amendments on the paths. So the areas in this bed where you can still see the grass, that's going to wind up being a path. And where there's compost is going to end up being a bed. And you can see a little bit more in here, the leaves getting covered with compost. The next step is to cover that stuff with a layer of cardboard and or newspaper. You want to make sure that all the edges overlap really well. And the function of that sheet layer, that's why it's called sheet mulching, is to smother the plant material below it. And then the last step is to cover the cardboard and newspaper with some sort of mulch layer. And that can be wood chips, that can be tree leaves, hay, straw, whatever you like. And that serves to keep the sheet layer from blowing away. And as the sheet layer biodegrades, that will become the finished soil surface. If you have access to a large amount of finished compost and you would like to be planting annual vegetables, you can also do what I sometimes call an upside down sheet mulch, which is where you lay the cardboard or newspaper directly on the ground and then put a thick, and say thick means at least 3 or 4 inches of finished compost on top of it. And then you put your mulch layer on top of the compost. And the advantage of that is it makes it really easy to direct sow annual vegetables. So you can then, plant a row of carrots or beets or lettuce, whatever, right into that finished compost without having to worry about the sheet layer. Now, when you're done sheet mulching and you've made that new bed, you can just let it sit for a while, but I tend to like to give it a really solid watering and plant directly into it. And you can do that by using a trowel or a spade, or one of my favorite tools, a Japanese soil knife called a hori-hori, to kind of cut through that sheet layer and plant whatever plants you want to plant directly into it. And that way you make the best use of that grace period where that sheet layer is in place and preventing weeds from coming up. So if you can plant your sheet mulch pretty densely, then the plants that you want to grow there will kind of have this edge on the weeds, and you can kind of fill up the spaces before weeds get a chance to grow there. So there's a picture of a mostly finished sheet mulch, and then this is 2 years later. All those sheet mulch beds have been filled with perennial companion plants for the fruit trees in the orchard. And this landscape is maintained only once a month and only for about 3 hours by usually 10 to 15 volunteers. So this is, I would say, a very low maintenance landscape. And we've got a question, and the question is, do I have any recommendations of where to get compost? I do. My favorite compost source is Wilshire Farm in Falmouth, and their compost costs $35 a yard, which is a reasonable price. And I definitely recommend buying locally produced compost in bulk rather than something in a bag. And the reason for that is compost has a lot of really nice features. It has soluble nutrients. It has stable carbon. It has food from microorganisms. That is food for plants. But really, the most important aspect of compost is the microorganisms that are living in it. And once you take that compost and seal it in a plastic bag, the microorganisms start to die off. And the longer it has been sealed in a plastic bag, the more of the microorganisms have died off or gone dormant. So by buying local compost in bulk, you get the most of that microorganism factor, and it's also substantially cheaper to do it that way. The only downside is if you don't have a truck or a trailer, it can be somewhat inconvenient. Wilshire Farms does deliver, but I think they only deliver over a certain number of yards. So if you run into issues with that, you might be able to, check in with your neighbors and see if anybody wants to split a load of compost, or you can rent a pickup truck and pick it up yourself. All right. So that's pretty much it for sheet mulch. Another view of a sheet mulch. This is in year 1. So in this area, we did plant a fair amount of annuals as well. So we've got sunflowers, ground cherries over here, as well as some perennial vegetables like bloody dock. All right, moving on to some recommendations for your edible landscape. And I'm going to start off with a couple of large shade trees. And usually people don't have a ton of room for large trees, so I'm going to skip through these pretty quickly. Chestnuts can be beautiful large trees. They produce large annual crops of starchy nuts that are quite delicious and have a similar nutritional profile to corn. So from the standpoint of produce a bunch of calories in on a perennial plant, that's probably the prime feature of chestnut. The native species here in Maine, the American chestnut, is unfortunately very susceptible to a now ever-present disease called chestnut blight, and there are several projects working on to breed blight-resistant American chestnuts, but none of those are publicly available yet. So you can either plant American chestnuts and expect them to die fairly young, or you can plant hybrid chestnuts that have some innate blight resistance. Peaches are fruit to grow in your edible landscape. Maine is kind of in a sweet spot for peach cultivation right now, where our climate has warmed enough that we can successfully overwinter and ripen peaches. But it hasn't been that way for long enough for all the peach diseases and pests to have become really common. So I highly recommend planting a peach tree or two. They are self-fertile, so unlike a lot of fruit trees, you can plant just one. And a single peach tree can bear huge amounts of fruit. This picture is from a Madison tree at my house that averaged about 75 pounds of fruit per year. And in a banner year like the one in this picture, we got about 150 pounds. And I would say that peaches are sort of a moderate difficulty fruit to grow. They pretty low maintenance, but there is a disease called brown rot, which if that disease shows up, it's very annoying and can spoil a lot of fruit. So it's good to, while your peaches are ripening, check them sort of daily and remove any that have obvious disease issues, which basically looks like mold growing on the fruit. And I highly recommend the book The Holistic Orchard by Michael Phillips if you're interested in growing fruit trees. Help you not only learn to recognize a lot of the pest and disease issues that may or may not come up, but to prevent them with probiotic and sort of nutrient sprays that can help the trees sort of fend off those diseases before they become an issue. So next question, I have a lot of colt's foot in my yard. Can you talk about that as an edible? So I would not consider colt's foot to be edible. And the reason for that is it has a alkaloid in it. It's the same alkaloid that's in comfrey. It's called pyrazine, I think, or something close to that. Commonly referred to as PA alkaloids. And so it's not something you would want to eat any real amount of. It is often used as a medicinal. And I think in a small, irregular amounts, like you would use it for, it's a traditional cough remedy. I think that's probably fine, but I definitely wouldn't eat it as a food. And then, what species of peaches grow in Vermont/Maine? So all peaches are the same species, but there are some cultivars that I would particularly recommend. So is a really great hardy peach. I would say it's almost as hardy as Reliance, but has better flavor and better yield. So Red Haven is my sort of general recommendation, reliance. If you're in a particularly cold spot, like if you're in zone 4, or if you have just a harsh microclimate, reliance might be a better option. They are, as the name suggests, very reliable. The most cold hardy peach that I'm aware of is called Siberian C. That's just the letter C. And it's actually a Russian rootstock variety that's been reselected by a guy in Wisconsin. And over 3 generations of, he more than doubled the fruit size. And they're one of the most reliable peaches for zone 4. And if you're in the warmer parts of zone 5 or any zone above that, I also really like Madison, which is a pretty hardy peach, but not quite as hardy as Red Haven or Reliance. But they just have really exceptional peach flavor. And one word of warning about growing your own peaches is that once you've had a tree ripened peach off your own tree, you'll probably never be satisfied with a peach from the store again. So ever since my first peach ripened, I've never bought a peach at the store because they're just not worth eating once you've had the real thing. American persimmon. If you're not familiar with these, it's not surprising. They're quite an unusual fruit, and they're not really suitable for the colder parts of Maine or New England. Like they're definitely hardy into zone 4, but they might not get enough heat to ripen unless they're in a really exceptional microclimate, like next to a parking lot or next to a pond or something like that. But in most of zone 5, as long as you're selecting early ripening varieties, they should ripen. And they have some really nice attributes. They're pretty much pest and disease free. I have only had very minor pest issues on my trees. They're super delicious, providing that they are fully ripe. If they're not quite ripe, they're quite astringent. But when they're ripe, they're sweet. They kind of have a soft texture like a tomato, and they taste like an apricot dipped in honey. They also ripen very, very late, usually in October in Maine, and the fruit will actually hold on through a pretty heavy frost. So you can be picking American persimmons in Maine well into November. And they're also just very ornamental, pretty trees. Got another question. Can peaches be grown in a espalier? I would say yes, but they don't take to espalier as well as like an apple or a pear. Peaches are also a pretty short-lived tree. 10 to 15 years is not an unusual lifespan for a peach in Maine. And that's okay because they come to fruit really quickly. So 3 or 4 years in the ground, and then they start fruiting quite heavily. But it takes so much time and effort to train a tree into an espalier that, if you're going to spend 5 years to really develop an espalier form, I would recommend a tree like an apple or a pear that can live in that trained form for a long time versus a peach that is going to die relatively much younger. Mulberries are another very low maintenance tree fruit. I definitely recommend Illinois everbearing. The flavor is excellent. It's a nice, pretty moderate sized tree. They usually top out around 25 feet. Very productive, and as the name everbearing suggests, very long season. So in my yard, this mulberry starts to ripen in June, around the same time that strawberries start to ripen, and starts to kind of peter out in like the end of September. So the whole summer, this tree is dropping these delicious, sweet and tart blackberry-like fruit. And because they ripen over such a long season, you don't usually get a mass amount at any one time that you would make, jams or jellies out of. But you get like a couple handfuls every day through the whole summer. And they're basically pest and disease free, although birds do also like to eat them, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. I tend to think of that as a good thing, both because I like birds, but mulberries also make an excellent trap crop, meaning that if there's a whole giant tree full of mulberries that the birds can eat as many of as they want, it kind of takes the pressure off of, say, the blueberries that I really want to harvest all those blueberries and not share very many with the birds. So having something else for the birds to focus on through that whole season is really nice. One noteworthy downside of mulberries, especially dark fruited mulberries like Illinois everbearing, is that they are highly staining. They'll certainly stain your hands and your face, but they are also capable of staining other things like concrete or asphalt or car paint. So definitely think about that when you choose where to plant your mulberry, and don't plant it anywhere where it's going to be a problem if it drops high output. Question: would persimmon do well in coastal climate in southern Maine? I would say yes, especially in a hot microclimate like next to a driveway or the south side of a building. And is September a good time to plant a mulberry tree? I would say yes, also, provided that it's a potted tree. Lots of trees are often planted bare root, and you want to do that much earlier in the spring or later in the fall. But potted stock can be planted most any time, but spring and fall are the best. And I think September is a perfectly good time. There are lots of different kinds of plums that we can grow here in Maine. The two that I recommend generally are the American plum, Prunus americana, and the beach plum, Prunus maritima. Both of those plums are kind of shrubby. The American plum, as you can see in this tree, is a small tree, and the beach plum is much more of a shrub, multi-stem shrub form. They're both native to Maine, and they're both pretty disease and pest resistant. Hybrid plums are very delicious, can be very productive, and if you want to get into fruit cultivation, go for it, but expect a lot of work, where these native plums, you can kind of let them go and expect to get a fair harvest without much work. This is what the ripening fruit looks like. It's not unusual to get masses of these small plums. They're about the size of a sweet cherry, and they taste very much like a hybrid plum when they're dead ripe. As they are approaching ripeness, they're good but not quite as sweet, and then there's a short period where they're perfect and just as good as a hybrid. I have found that they do not dry well, but they do make good jams, jellies, and fruit butters. Paw Paw, or Asimina triloba, is North America's largest native fruit tree. They're not native in Maine, but they are native as close by as New York State. So pretty much near native, I would say. Another one that is very low maintenance. Paw Paw is a little bit finicky to get established, but once established, they are extremely low maintenance, and they're actually the only fruit tree that I'm aware of that is highly deer and rodent resistant. And I should mention with the plums, you do need two genetically distinct individuals in order to get fruit. So if you're planting seedlings, which is usually how you find American plums, any two seedlings will pollinate each other. But if they have cultivar names, Dalton's American or something like that, you need two different ones, or one cultivar and a seedling. Paw Paw also pretty much requires cross-pollination, so you want to plant at least two. Like the American persimmon, Paw Paws are going to be hardy basically throughout New England, but only early ripening cultivars are likely to ripen in our climate. So you want to be careful with which ones you pick. I've had very good luck with those trees establishing and fruiting with high quality fruit. The paradox of Paw Paw cultivation, especially with seedlings, is in order to ripen fruit, especially in a northern climate, you want to plant that plant in full sun. However, because Paw Paw naturally grows in the understory of forests, full sun will actually kill a young Paw Paw. So you want to plant your seedling and then provide them with some sort of temporary shade. And that temporary shade can be a plastic grow tube. It can be a tomato cage with some cloth over the top. It can be tall annuals or perennials planted around the tree that can then grow up above them as the tree gets larger. You can plant it in the shade of an existing tree that once the paw is established, you cut down. You need shade for a couple years, and then full sun is ideal. The Paw Paw fruit looks kind of like a lumpy mango, and tastes kind of halfway between a mango and a banana, and the fruit pulp is very custardy, kind of like a ripe avocado. And if you've never had them, they are really a delightful fruit, and most people's first thought is, wow, this is so tropical. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because the Paw Paw is the only temperate member of the Annonaceae family, which has many, many members in the tropics, like the custard apple and the sapote and the cherimoya. So if you're familiar with tropical fruit, there's probably lots of Paw Paw relatives that you're familiar with. But this is the only one that will grow in Maine. All right, on to some shrubs. So hazelnuts make a really nice hedge or landscape shrub. This is what they look like when they're developing. They usually grow in a burr like this, which has like 1 to 7 nuts in a cluster. You need 2 for pollination, but they're pretty easy to grow, and the big challenge with hazelnuts is getting to them before the squirrels do. And the most effective way to deal with that is to eat. But if that's not an option, having a dog around makes a big difference, and keeping your hazelnut planting well away from woodlands also helps a lot. So if hazelnuts are kind of really out in the open and squirrels have to travel a long way across open ground to get to them, they'll be a lot less likely to clean them out before you get a chance to harvest them. Blueberries are a really nice crop that most people are familiar with. They're native here in Maine and have pretty easy requirements. The biggest requirement of blueberries, both high bush and low bush, is acidic soil. So most soils in Maine are pretty acidic anyway, so that's often not a problem. But if you're going to be planting more than a few blueberries, I would recommend spending I think it's like $16-ish to send some soil samples to the University of Maine at Orono, and you can check the blueberry box on that soil test, and they will tell you what your pH is of your soil and a bunch of other things, and what, if any, amendments you need to make in order to grow healthy blueberries. I will mention or dispel some common myths about acidifying soil for blueberries. You can not acidify soil for coffee grounds unless it's like a huge amount of coffee grounds. And the reason for that is pine needles and oak leaves are acidic, but the acids that are in there are tannins, and tannins are both water soluble and biodegradable. So once you put those leaves on, there's only a short period of time when they have any acidifying effect. And then over the long term, those type of mulches tend to build soil carbon, which is wonderful. We should always be building soil carbon. But the more you build carbon in soils, the more those soils tend towards neutral. And for most crops, neutral is basically where you want your soil pH. But blueberries really like highly acid soil. So if you acidify your soil a little bit or a lot, I would recommend using agricultural sulfur. And sulfur comes in a few different forms, and you want what are called prills, which look like little lentils made of pressed sulfur. And it doesn't take a whole lot of that to acidify your soil for a few years, and you might need to reapply once in a few years. Okay, I've got a few questions here that I can catch up on. What is the best fruit tree for espalier? I think apples and pears are both really nice in espalier. If you have a super warm spot and want to try something a little bit out of the box, you could try a fig, especially on the low espalier or an espalier right up against a south wall. No. Get back to my questions here. Does the Illinois everbearing need full sun? Will partial shade work? I would say you're going to get best production in full sun, but I did have one that was in part shade for several years until I cut down another tree to make more sun. And that tree did just fine. It was just a bit slower growing and didn't produce as much fruit, but part shade will work, generally speaking. Can you ever get witch's broom out of a high bush blueberry? Yes and no. The witch's broom is a disease that causes dense clustering of twigs in blueberries, and if it's just sort of a one-off, you can prune it out pretty easily. If you're pruning out a disease like that, you want to wipe your pruners with alcohol and let it sit for a second in between cuts so that you're not accidentally moving the disease-causing organisms around through the plant. If you're having reoccurrences of witch's broom over and over again, it's because there's an alternate host nearby. And I believe the alternate host for witch's broom are spruce trees. So if you've got a bunch of spruce trees nearby that are hosting the witch's broom, then your blueberries might just continually get reinfected. So your options are, in that case, just keep pruning it out. If it's at a low enough level, that's an option. Trying to get rid of the alternate host. Maybe you cut down some of those spruce trees, and that might help a lot. Or grow something else. There is the fruit that is, I would say, most like high bush blueberry that I'm aware of is called hascap or honeyberry, Lanicera cerulea. They're also quite easy to grow. They're not as fussy about soil pH as blueberries. They'll grow basically in any non-extreme soil pH. They do better with shade than blueberries. They bloom super early, like mine started blooming like a week and a half ago, and they ripen starting around the end of June. So they're a very nice fruit. They're not quite as sweet as blueberries, but if you're having trouble with high bush blueberries and want something similar, that's what I would recommend. And another question, will fig grow here? Brown turkey, question mark. Brown turkey is a good option. Figs can be grown in Maine, but they're finicky. So there are some varieties like Chicago Hardy that will survive without any special protection, but they don't generally fruit. So if you want to grow figs, a extremely hot microclimate helps a lot. So right up against the south side of a building. And then they also need some sort of winter protection. The simplest way to do that is to just grow them in a really big pot and then put the pot in your basement over the winter. But you can grow them directly in the ground by planting them at sort of a 45-degree angle. And then when it's time for them to go dormant for the season, you wait until after the first frost. They'll drop all their leaves. And then you pin them to the ground with a bag of mulch and then cover over with a heavy layer of mulch, and that actually protects the tree over the winter. So you can grow figs in Maine, but it takes some extra effort. There are all sorts of cane fruits that you can grow as part of your edible landscape. The usual problem that people run into, especially with red raspberries and blackberries, is that the canes sucker all over the place and they're covered in thorns, and it turns into sort of an impenetrable tangle that doesn't fruit particularly well, and it's difficult to get at the fruit anyway. My favorite answer to that is black raspberries. These are native to Maine, and they don't sucker off the roots almost at all. Instead, black raspberries reproduce vegetatively by tip layering. So the cane grows up and it sort of arches, and when that tip of the cane hits the ground again, that's where a new cane pops up. And if you prune them and or trellis them so that those canes don't do that and they don't touch the ground, then they tend to not spread at all. They just grow in a clump where you planted them. So they're a little bit easier to maintain than red raspberries or blackberries, and they are delicious, full of antioxidants, and just a really nice cane fruit to grow. That said, I also love red raspberries, especially the ever-bearing varieties that produce 2 crops per year. And those are especially nice when you have mown grass areas, where you can kind of plant up against the edge of a mowed grass lawn, and you can either use a artificial rhizome barrier, like plastic or metal buried in the ground to stop the canes from spreading out of where you want them to grow, or you can use a sort of natural rhizome barrier or natural conditions, like if you have a woodland edge, and you can plant your raspberries in between the woods and a mown grass area, and as they spread into the grass, they just get hit by the mower, and as they spread into the woods, they kind of stop because it's too shady. So those are some thoughts on cane fruit. This is Gumi, Elaeagnus multiflora. If you're familiar with autumn olive, Gumi is a less invasive or non-invasive relative. I'm pretty sure that every single autumn olive seed always sprouts, and I have collected hundreds of Gumi seeds and never gotten good germination. So I think that has a lot to do with why they're not invasive. But they're delicious, sweet, and tart fruits that grow on a shrub. They ripen in the summer, and I would say their flavor is most reminiscent of a pomegranate. I got another question. Will the black raspberries do well with some morning and afternoon sun, about 6 hours? And I would say yes. Black raspberries produce better than most fruits in part shade, and with about 6 hours of sun, you should get very good results. How deep would a buried barrier have to be? I assume that's for something like red raspberries, and I would go for at least 12 inches. So you can use aluminum flashing for that, and you can also get purpose-made plastic rhizome barrier by Googling rhizome barrier. So Gumi is a nice, very pretty landscape shrub It's also a nitrogen fixer. So if you have a spot with sort of weak soil, gumi can be a nice option for something that's going to produce well without having to build up good soil first. Elderberries are a beautiful landscape shrub that produces a delicious and medicinal fruit. These are native here in Maine, and if you start kind of scoping them out while their distinctive white flowers are out, they can also be a nice thing to wild harvest. But they make a lovely landscape plant as well. Unlike most fruiting trees and shrubs, elderberries are pretty tolerant of wet soil. So they don't like to be in the swamp, but they can be quite happy being swamp adjacent. So if you've got a damp spot that you're unsure of what to do with, an elderberry can be a really nice edible plant to go in that spot. Tuna sinensis, a fragrant spring tree. This is a tree leaf crop from China. Not totally hardy here in Maine. In most winters, the one I have at my place dies back to the ground, but keeps coming back every year. And the flavor of these leaves is really incredible. They are a little bit hard to describe, but I would say they taste kind of like a bouillon cube without the salt. So really sort of complex, savory, umami flavor, and almost hard to believe that it's a tree leaf. Do elderberries require full sun or would partial shade work? Elderberries actually do quite well in partial shade. Any fruit that's growing in partial shade, they're never quite as productive as if they were growing in full sun. But I have a elderberry in my yard that was planted by a bird. I probably wouldn't have chosen to put an elderberry in this spot because I would have assumed it was too shady. But it yields pretty well, and it probably only gets like 2 to 3 hours of direct sun. So it gets, dappled shade through the rest of the day. But if you've got a part shade spot where you want to try out an elderberry, I would say go for it. And another question, what is the minimum depth for blueberries and dwarf banana in a container? And is a soil acidifier mixed with the potting soil sufficient? So minimum depth, I would say probably around 12 inches. For growing plants like that in a container, I would aim for a 5-gallon or more container if possible. And yes, I would say a soil acidifier mixed with the potting soil is definitely going to be sufficient. And if you're doing a few, you might be better off just buying a bale of peat moss, which is going to be plenty acidic already, and then mixing that with some sand or perlite to make your own potting soil, because most potting soil is actually native peat moss just with lime mixed in to temper the acidity of the peat moss. So you can kind of skip that lime, and you'll have quite acidic potting soil already. Yellowhorn is another beautiful sort of shrubby tree that I've been really excited about. It is a nitrogen-fixing nut tree from China, and I've had them bloom in as little as 3 years. So they seem to be quite precocious, and they make a spherical capsule that opens up and has about a dozen small nuts in it. And the nuts are really fatty and taste like macadamia nuts. So they're quite delicious. And the trees themselves are quite beautiful. There's lots of different types of cherries. And despite what my slideshow has, I'm actually going to recommend not what's in the slideshow. I'm going to recommend cornelian cherry or Cornus moss, which is actually not a cherry. It's actually a edible fruited dogwood. And the reason for that is those trees are very reliable with virtually no maintenance. Like all Prunus species, cherries tend to get brown rot and other pest and disease issues that are really annoying to deal with. Those trees can totally be worth growing if you're excited about growing fruit, but if you just want a tree that's going to look really nice and produce a good amount of fruit without much work and without spraying anything, then I would definitely recommend Cornus moss variety like Elegant or Pioneer. Areas, and move on to some perennial vegetables. So this is sea kale, and this is the plant that I usually recommend to people when they're looking to start off perennial vegetables. And the reason for that is the plant is easy to grow, does well in sort of regular vegetable garden conditions, and has a bunch of different harvests throughout the season. And all of those harvests pretty closely resemble a familiar crop. So young sea kale leaves, like you could pick in my garden right now, pretty closely resemble kale in flavor and texture. The more mature leaves are very the flower buds resemble broccoli, and the immature seed pods taste like snap peas. And in between the flower buds and the seed pods, you get these lovely flowers, which are very attractive to beneficial insects, especially syrphid flies, and are heavily honey scented. So you can smell these from like 15 or 20 feet away, and they have this wonderful fragrance. And a question, is elderberry poisonous when not ripe enough? Not that I'm aware of, but it is, I should have mentioned that elderberry is not a fruit that you eat out of hand. It should always be cooked, and is most commonly used in preparations that also remove the seeds. So like jams or jellies and syrups. Black elderberries, you can eat the seeds as long as they're cooked, but you don't want to eat a few elderberries, which is fine because raw elderberries don't taste. All right, another perennial vegetable, this time a clumping herbaceous vine called Tablitzia. This is my personal favorite green vegetable. It is a spinach relative, and it has a sort of mild spinachy flavor. It does not contain oxalic acid, so it doesn't leave that sort of weird feeling on your teeth. And it's a bit of a lighter textured leaf than spinach is. So the texture is a little bit more like lettuce, but the flavor is more like spinach. Highly nutritious, quite easy to grow, at least in Maine and New England. Once you get into southern New England and south, the summers tend to get a bit hot. Habilitia does not like really hot summers. Really thrives in shade. They're not quite as productive in dense shade, but growing them in shade makes them very easy to grow because they don't have that heat stress in the summer, and you get really high quality leaves over a very long season. So I have a Habilitia plant that's growing completely under the canopy of a cherry tree, and it just grows as a ground cover. In this picture, you can see it growing up a trellis, which it also does quite nicely. But underneath the cherry tree, I can start harvesting Habilitia shoots in April, and I can continue harvesting shoots and then individual leaves basically till the end of September or early October. So it's a very productive vegetable, and has a really long season. These are the flowers of Turkish rocket. I wish I had another picture. So Turkish rocket is one of the easiest to grow of all perennial vegetables. It is a brassica, as you can see by these pictures. And there's a few different harvests that you can get from this plant. Right now, we are harvesting the young, tender leaves, which are quite delicious. Kind of bitter, like a mustard green. Unlike mustard greens, they don't seem to suffer from flea beetles or any pest or disease issues, which is nice. And they're perennial, so they come back stronger every year. And in a few weeks, the Turkish rocket plants will begin to put out flower buds, which is my personal favorite harvest from this plant. The flower buds are a lot like broccoli rabe. Definitely, it's a stronger flavor than broccoli rabe, a little bit more spicy, a little bit more bitter, and it almost has just a hint of seaweed flavor. But I think it's very pleasant. And then later in the season, the leaves get a little bit coarser and they get a little bit fuzzy. Still totally edible, but mostly they're useful as like a braising green. So something you're going to cook at a low temperature for a long period, and they're quite good like that, almost in the same way of like southern style collards are cooked. Garden sorrel is another really nice perennial leaf green. It has a very distinctive flavor. It's very like sour and lemony. Goes great with fish. It's a nice addition to a salad. There's a French sorrel soup that some people really like. I particularly like a specific cultivar of garden sorrel that never blooms, which makes the harvest season really, really long. So within a couple weeks of the snow melting, there are usually harvestable leaves, and you keep getting more and more harvestable leaves until the first killing frost. So they can be very, very productive over a long season. They grow well in part shade or full sun, and they form a really dense, tight clump and don't spread unless you divide them. So sometimes I kind of wish they would spread, but it's also really convenient to have some plants that just kind of take up the space where you put them. They hold that space, but you know, you never get too many of them. And I did forget to mention with the Turkish rocket that these do tend to self-sow to a degree that's kind of annoying. So I highly recommend eating a bunch of the flower buds. If you want to let some of the flowers bloom for pollinators, and just because they're pretty, that's great. But when the flowers start to fade, I would chop them off and toss them in the compost, just so that you take them down before they set viable seed, and that way you don't have to worry about them seeding in and being annoying. This is another perennial vegetable. This one is called Dystania, and has a very it tastes a lot like celery. Also has a beautiful flower. It's highly attractive to insects. I don't know if you can see on this picture, but there's, I think, like 8 or 9 species of insect feeding on this flower. There are many, many different types of perennial alliums that make great edible landscape plants. This is one of my favorites. It's called mouse garlic. I would say it's most similar to garlic chives, but I like the flavor better. It's a little milder, and you get these beautiful purple flowers, which are also edible. You can eat the whole plant, although I mostly harvest the leaves and flowers. But if I'm going to dig one up for propagation or to move it or something, I'll also eat some of the bulbs at that time. Some of my other favorite perennial alliums are the nodding onion, Allium cneum, and Egyptian walking onion, Allium X proliferum. And I always like to have a diversity of things, but if I was going to choose one to start with, I would probably choose the mouse garlic, and then the next one to add would be the walking onion. And the walking onion is called that because instead of a true flower like the mouse garlic, it makes a little bulb on top called a top set. And eventually the weight of that top set kind of knocks the plant over, and it starts to grow again from the top set. And through this mechanism, it kind of walks around the garden. But those make a really lovely green onion, and you can just keep cutting them and cutting them once they're established, and they just keep growing back. Lovage is related to Dystania and other plants in the Apiaceae or carrot family. Very attractive to beneficial insects and most pollinators. Lovage is really more of a culinary herb than a vegetable. And it has a really nice flavor, but it's really strong. So it's easy to take, a big handful of spring lovage shoots, which look amazing, and put them into a soup or a stir fry, and just come up with something that is overwhelmingly tastes like lovage. So a few tablespoons of lovage leaves and shoot are excellent in a soup or a stir fry, but it doesn't take much more than that. Stinging nettles. These are one of my favorite spring vegetables. This time of year, I pretty much eat stinging nettles for breakfast every day. And they're one of the most nutrient-dense vegetables out there, and they're called stinging nettles because they are covered in what are essentially tiny hypodermic needles filled with acid, and those needles are actually made of silica, so they're like little glass prickers. So when I harvest nettles, I use gloves, and as soon as the nettles are either dried or cooked, the sting is deactivated. So definitely something you want to be aware of. If you plant some stinging nettles, they do sting, and you don't want to just be careful handling them. Stinging nettles are highly regarded as a medicinal, both in the form of a nettle tea or a tincture, but also the sting itself is considered medicinal by some people, kind of in the same way that people use honeybee stings to treat arthritis. You can also use nettle stings in the same way. Good King Henry is spinach relative, like Hablitzia. Good King Henry has a form much more like regular spinach. And I think as a cooked green, it is very similar to spinach. I think it has kind of a weird aftertaste raw, so I don't really recommend it as a raw green, but it makes a lovely cooked alternative to spinach and is much, much easier to grow than regular spinach. Along with the edible leaves, it also has edible flower buds, which gives this plant one of its common names, which is poor man's asparagus. Also, if you have a decent sized pack, pretty easy to harvest enough of the seeds to use them as a pseudo cereal. This plant is related to quinoa, and the seeds cook up fairly similar to a quinoa. There's lots of different kinds of bee balm that are beautiful in an edible landscape, and all species of bee balm are edible. Kind of like lovage, they're a little bit more on the end of like culinary herb than actual vegetable, but they have a great flavor that's kind of like halfway between oregano and basil. So they make a nice addition to, any sort of Italian dish. They make a really nice infused vinegar that in some ways resembles, I'm drawing a blank, but the flavored vinegars, and highly attractive to lots of insects and other pollinators. The most common bee balm is the red blooming Monarda didyma, and those, my favorite part is just the bright red floret, which has a sweet kind of almost fruity flavor, not unlike a hibiscus flower. So if you've got some bee balm growing already, I highly recommend tasting the leaves, the flowers, and trying to utilize them in cooking. Comfrey is not really edible. It has many medicinal uses, but I wouldn't recommend eating it in any quantity or on any regularity. But I do mention it in this edible landscape talk because it's such a useful plant. In this photo, you can see it being used as a garden border. This variety, specifically Bocking 14, is a sterile seeded hybrid. I have gotten some suspicious potential seedlings since I started planting lots of other varieties of comfrey. So it might be more accurate to say that Bocking 14 is self-sterile. So if you only plant Bocking 14, I've never gotten any seedlings. If you have several varieties of comfrey, you might start to get seedlings. But because this one doesn't generally seed in and it doesn't spread, it kind of just forms a tight clump in the spot where you put it. You can use it as a barrier against weeds or against rhizomous grasses moving from where you want them to be into other areas. It makes a great compost activator. It makes a great dynamic accumulator, which means that it brings up lots of nutrients from the subsoil, which you can then provide to other plants by chopping down the comfrey and letting it become part of the mulch or compost in place. And these the flowers are very attractive to bumblebees, and you can also use the leaves as fodder for animals. Like I feed it to my chickens. Not all the time, but occasionally. And I've got a question. How do you cook nettles for breakfast? So my favorite way to eat nettles for breakfast is I steam the nettles, and this time of year, I just grab a whole clump, stems and all, throw it in a pot with a little bit of water, steam them for 3 or 4 minutes, and then I fry an egg and put a little bit of cheese on top and toast a piece of bread, and I put a thick layer of steamed nettles on the toast, and then a fried egg with a little bit of cheese melted on it on top of that, and that's my go-to breakfast this time of year. But nettles and eggs, I think, are a really great combination. So they're also good, like in a quiche. You can make a nettle quiche or nettle frittata. I sometimes will steam the nettles in a pan and then crack eggs into it and make like a nettle scramble. But recently I've been enjoying the texture of the steamed nettles with a fried egg on top. Couple of fruiting vines to round out the talk. These are 3 different varieties of hardy kiwi. And there are many species of kiwi throughout the world, and there are 2 common ones that are grown in Maine. And they are Actinidia arguta, which is what is in this picture, and Actinidia colomicta, which is also called the Arctic Beauty kiwi. And if you want maximum production, Actinidia arguta is the species you want, but they are extremely vigorous. So anytime you're planting a kiwi, you are agreeing to a lifetime of annual pruning. And if you leave that piece of land and the next person doesn't want a lifetime of pruning, I think it's your responsibility to remove the kiwi vines, because unpruned kiwis get huge and can become quite a problem of just tangled messes of vines. And when I say they get huge, those kiwi vines can reach 120 feet long and 18 inches in diameter. So they're a pretty amazing vine. The Actinidia colomicta is a bit more subdued. So if you want a kiwi that's not going to throw a 20-foot long vine in a single season, I definitely recommend the colomicta. But they're both super delicious. The flavor is a lot like the fuzzy kiwi, but sweeter and more intensely flavored. And also they have smooth skin, so you eat the whole thing. So each little small kiwi has the same amount of flavor as the whole big kiwi. And there's a follow-up question on the nettles. Eat the whole nettle. Yes. So when they're young, like this time of year, the stems haven't started to get fibrous yet. So I will, right now the ones in my garden are like, let's say 4 to 8 inches tall, and I'll just grab a handful of the whole thing, cut it right to the ground, and eat that whole thing, and they're lovely. In a few weeks, they'll be taller, and the stems will start to get fibrous, and they're still totally edible, but later in the season, the stems get tough enough that you want to just remove the leaves from the stem and just eat the leaves and leave the stem behind. All right, another fruiting vine. This is one of my favorites. It's called Schizandra chinensis. And this is a self-fruitful variety called Eastern Prince. And Schisandra comes from China, where it's called Wu Wei Zi, which translates to 5-flavor fruit or 5-flavor berry. It's a really complex, interesting flavor that everyone seems to experience differently, to the point where it's actually used as a diagnostic tool in Eastern medicine, where they'll have you eat the Schisandra berry and pay close attention to what the first flavor you taste is, and that's supposed to indicate what elements are lacking from your constitution. And they're highly regarded as an adaptogen in both Eastern and Western herbal medicine. But I just love the flavor. It is complex, it's sweet, sour, maybe a little bit of salty, and then as you bite through the seed, it's a little bit spicy in the same way that ginger is spicy. So really interesting fruit. Not everybody likes it. When I do garden tours, I always hand out dried Schisandra berries. And I would say about 3/4 of the people are really into it, and about 1/4 are just like, ugh, why would you ever eat that? So if you get a chance to try the fruit before planting it, that's probably a good idea. But even if you don't eat the fruit, they're beautiful vines with little magnolia-shaped flowers and these big clusters of bright red fruit. Grapes. Most varieties of grapes are a little bit finicky here in Maine, but Concord type grapes, which are usually Vitis labrusca hybrids, tend to do quite well. They can be surprisingly shade tolerant, which grapes usually aren't. And they pair really well with chickens. So if you have confined chickens, combining that chicken run or chicken pen with a grape trellis can be a really nice way to kind of automatically manage pests and diseases. The reason for that is the primary pest that we get on grapes is Japanese beetles. And Japanese beetles are really easy to manage if they've got chickens running under them. And that's 2 reasons. If you go to let your chickens out in the morning and while it's still kind of cool and you shake the grapevines, all the Japanese beetles fall off and the chickens will eat them. Japanese beetles also have a part of their life cycle where they are a grub in the soil. And if there's chickens scratching around underneath the vines, then that part of the life cycle gets interrupted because as the chickens eat the grubs. And then obviously all the chicken manure leads to very rich soil for the grapes. And more questions. Can Schisandra grow in this area? Yes, Schisandra grows very nicely in Maine. They're hardy down to zone 3 or 4. So pretty much anywhere in Maine they'll grow. They can grow in full sun in Maine, which they need some shade further south, but full sun to part shade, they grow very well. And can you make jam out of the Eastern Prince? You definitely can. I haven't yet, but I should try that. I think that would be really interesting. I've also been meaning to make a Schisandra cheesecake because I think that would be a really interesting flavor experience, but haven't got around to it yet. And one other Schisandra question: do any wildlife eat Schisandra fruit? I have not had any issues with any wildlife eating the fruit yet. That doesn't mean that it won't happen eventually, but I haven't had to net that fruit yet, and I've harvested quite a lot. Many years I harvest more than 20 pounds of fruit from a single vine. And that is the end of my slideshow. And I am going to stop the screen share. And I would be happy to take any questions that people have. So you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask any questions about edible landscaping that you might have.
Erin, this is Gail. I don't have any questions, but I want to thank you. This has been really good. I've made lots of notes. I'm going to buy several different varieties of things to add to my little piece of land that I have, and this was very helpful. Thank you.
Excellent. You're welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it. All right. Well, last call for questions, and if there aren't any questions, I will hand it over to Jenna. But there's
Erin,
at least one question.
I have one question.
Yep, go for it.
The mulberry bush. I've only seen one mulberry bush in my life, and it was large. It was tall. It was, I don't know, 20 feet, maybe, I don't know, 20 feet. It was huge. Are there dwarf mulberry bushes? I really like the taste. I like the jams. I understand the staining that goes with it. Actually, my dad actually chopped his mulberry bush down because the staining was an issue, but was wondering what your thoughts were if they were dwarf mulberries.
Yes. So around here, I think the best dwarf cultivar is called Giraldi Dwarf. And those top out at around like 6 to 7 feet tall. So it's a quite dwarfed form. And it's also nice for picking because the internodes are really short. So the space between the leaves and the space between the fruit is super small. So you get tons of really densely packed fruit on a small bush.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yep. And one other thing about mulberries is if staining is an issue, there are light colored fruit cultivars like Beautiful Day, which has white fruit, or Sweet Lavender, which has like light purple fruit that are non-staining.
Erin, question for you. This is Damon. So with all of the increased demand in garden stores and your nursery, do you have any recommendations for people looking to acquire some of the plants you talked about today, given all the demand, and say some alternative sources for, say, propagation or purchasing of plants?
Thank you, Damon, for that softball question. I still have tons of plants in stock. If you look at my web store and you see something that's out of stock, it's probably not that it's actually out of stock. It's just that it's gotten too large to ship. So if you're looking for any of these plants, I have most of them to sell. Other good options are Fedco seeds if you want to grow from seed, or Jail Hudson seeds if you want to try some really unusual edible landscape plants. And I'm going to put a link to my web store in the chat box. And there are also some other small local nurseries that I'd like to shout out that have, they're not as focused on edible landscape plants as my nursery is, but they have the great plants and always a few edible landscape plants. So like Rizbara's nursery in Portland, they usually carry sea kale and log cabin perennials in Saco. I was there just the other day, and they had some really rare perennial vegetables like Ligularia fisheri and Phlomis, and some really nice plants. Question from Joe: do you ship to Vermont? I do. I ship anywhere in the U.S.
My name is Mona. I'm wondering if you have experience with currants and if you can share any comments about that.
Yeah, I don't really have much experience with currants because here in Maine, at least in this part of Maine, there's a blanket ban on the genus Ribes because they are a alternate host for hemlock, or not hemlock, white pine blister rust. And a while ago, all of the northern states kind of banned cultivation of Ribes. And with more recent science, most of those bans have gone away, and the Maine forestry department has kind of anything about it. So we're not allowed to grow currants here, so I don't really have much information on them.
Thank you.
And yeah, you're welcome. I've got a question from Gail. Am I open for customers? So I haven't been having regular retail hours. Instead, I've been asking people to order ahead, and then if you're local, you can come pick up your plants at the nursery. And what that leaves out is the sort of interaction that I usually have with customers of trying to help people figure out which plants are going to be best for their situation. And if you want that sort of, quickie consultation for which plants might be best for you, you're welcome to call me. My phone number is on the top of the handout, which is linked in the chat. And I can help you. Hopefully later in the spring, I might start having regular open hours again. I've just been so busy with shipped orders and wanting to keep the amount of face-to-face interactions minimized for right now. So that's where I'm at with that. But do feel free to email or call to pick up at the nursery.
So I guess if that's all for questions, just a reminder, I will send out a follow-up email with the recording of this video so that if you missed anything or want to refer back to it, you will have that option. And I'll also send a bunch of links to Aaron's website and his contact info, and I'll send that handout again. I know that some of the people that called in on their phones weren't able to access the chat option. So I will be following up with all that information. So stay tuned for tomorrow or the next day. I'll send that out. So
thanks, Jenna.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Aaron, and thank you everyone that tuned in and stuck through it for the 2 hours. I know it can be a little long sometimes, but thanks for being here. And I'll also be sending that link for donations towards our program in Gorham as well, if you want to donate to that as well. So thanks, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone.